God.
Welcome back, Graham.
Thank you.
When we left, it was between 1955 and 1957. You were a house officer at Hammersmith.
Yeah.
And then you got what was, in essence, a draft notice from the British government, and that spurred up your ideas of moving to the United States.
Yes. Well, I had a choice, either going home to New Zealand or coming to the States.
Okay.
But there was a little pressure for me to come to the States.
Her name was Elizabeth, I believe?
It was Elizabeth and Elizabeth's family.
Yeah.
Because I don't think they wanted their daughter to go off to the other side of the world.
Yeah. So then you applied to various programs in various positions in the United States.
I had, in the previous year when I visited America, I had visited each of the New York hospital. I met Loeb, who was chair of medicine at Columbia, and I met the chair of medicine at New York University. So I applied to those three. I applied to the three divisions of Bellevue. Bellevue then was run by the three universities.
Huh.
And there was a division of some of the very, very fine catheterizations and cardiac catheterizations were done by the Columbia division at Bellevue. So I applied to them. I applied to Boston schools. I applied to in Chicago to a hospital that I wouldn't want to be seen.
All right, so then in 1958, you go to Cornell.
Well, I didn't hear from anybody except I heard from Tom Almy. Tom had just moved from New York Hospital, where he was chief of GI, to be the chair of the Cornell division at Bellevue.
Okay.
And he was a real gentleman. And he replied, and he said, "I'm sorry, we don't have anything for you here at Bellevue.
Okay.
But why don't you write to Marvin Schlesinger, who's just taken over the GI division at Cornell?
Okay.
And he may have something for you. Or you could try Rulon Rawson, who was chief of medicine at Memorial Sloan Kettering. I didn't want to do cancer fellowship, but the idea of GI seemed pretty good.
Okay.
So I sent a letter to Marvin, and Marvin sent me a telegram offering me a position
Nice.
as a research fellow on a grant.
Okay.
Oh, for the enormous amount of $5,000 a year.
To live in New York City.
Wow!
Yes. Good.
And so that was a pretty. The only other reply that I got from my inquiries were from Columbia, from Loeb, that came in late because he was on sabbatical,
Right.
and from hematologists out in I guess Washington U, Seattle,
Right.
Washington U,
St. Louis.
Yes, and that would have been a possibility. So
But go ahead. So from 1958 to 1969, you're at Cornell New York Hospital. Tell us what your job.
yeah. Well, I came in as a research fellow, and I stayed a research fellow for the first 2 years, and I had a lab. But there were also, Marvin just had an NIH training grant, which had clinical as well as research. There were 2 fellows in the clinical fellowships, like ours, and there was 1 research fellow. That was me.
Okay.
But I was interested in clinical.
Right.
So I was spending my time about 50% research in the lab, and I would help the clinical fellows with consultation.
Okay.
And I had I had brought with me liver biopsy needles, and I introduced percutaneous liver biopsy to New York Hospital.
Nice.
Because before that time, if you wanted a liver biopsy, you had to call the surgeons and they would make a little incision and take a biopsy.
So you brought that technique to New York.
So I was seeing quite a few patients, and I was also attending on the teaching service.
Right. So what would describe some of your research activities at that time?
Well, my research initially was related. I inherited a technique of starch gel electrophoresis. And we had a big barrel of the right kind of starch, and I would cook up this for electrophoresis, and I was doing electrophoresis of all sorts of things. Serum, and I did some work with changes in the serum in liver disease, but I also started doing studies with gastric juice.
Right.
One of the things, well, GI division was supposed to do gastric analyses and all of the pernicious anemia patients had to have their stomachs pumped to do cytology for cancer as prophylaxis, because it was thought if you had pernicious anemia, you were likely to get gastric cancer. So I was washing the stomach, but I would put a tube down, collect gastric juice under stimulation, and then then put down the volume of fluid to wash the mucosa and send that off for cytology.
Right.
So I got a lot of gastric juice, and I started doing normals as well. I even did myself a few times to collect normal gastric juice, and I was electrophoresing that, adding radioactive B12, and defining intrinsic factor.
Okay.
So I obtained, I gained information on the on the quantitation of intrinsic factor, the B12 binding of intrinsic factor in gastric juice, normal, at rest, fasting, as well as stimulating.
And then you detected antibodies in some of these pernicious...
I found that there was a paper that came from Scandinavia suggesting that pernicious anemia was an immunologic disease, and that some of them had antibodies. And how they showed the antibodies was that they'd take serum, add it to B12 intrinsic factor, and give it to pernicious anemia patients, and find that the serum inhibited the absorption. So I was able then to show that there were parietal cell antibodies. So I had gone out to the Middle East, the Midwest, and learned how to work a cryostat and how to do staining with
antibodies.
With antibodies.
Yeah.
So I would do antibody studies on pernicious anemia, on serum, to detect parietal cell antibody and then intrinsic factor antibody.
Right.
And then I collected serum from all the patients with liver disease and did a study on the antibodies in primary biliary cirrhosis.
Okay.
I think I had about 30 patients with primary biliary cirrhosis. and found that if a patient showed up with a high alkaline phosphatase with early liver disease, that was the only abnormality. But these patients also had antibodies, and they were in fact early preclinical, if you like, primary biliary. So that was this didn't get published at all, but that was interesting.
Yeah.
My lab also did all of the the quantitative fat studies in 3-day stools.
Right.
We had a lot. We did the whole hospital for that.
So malabsorption studies.
So we got into malabsorption.
Yeah.
And of course, this was a time in the late 50s, early 60s, when the first gastric biopsy tubes and the first intestinal biopsy tubes came out.
Yeah.
And that was the opportunity to do a lot of histopathology and biochemical studies on the biopsies.
Yeah.
So we learned a lot about malabsorption.
Yeah.
So
then going into the 60s, you joined the staff at
well,
Division of
I
Gastroenterology.
became an assistant professor, and
Okay.
then I became an associate professor.
Okay. And Marvin Schlesinger.
And I was doing about, maybe 50% in the lab.
Uh-huh.
And we did, we had a couple of trips to Europe, to meetings.
Mm-hmm.
I got into another aspect, the problem of protein losing enteropathy. And I was doing a lot of studies on measuring the protein loss.
Right. So just for the audience, Dr. Marvin Schlesinger was the division chief of gastroenterology
Yes.
at New York Hospital, and he was the co-author of the major gastroenterology textbook, Schlesinger.
He took over as the editor of this gastroenterology text,
Okay.
and I became the associate editor.
Yeah.
So I
person who does the work.
I was reviewing a lot of papers submitted
Uh-huh.
from Martin Grossman, from all of the. That was the place to publish your work.
So then Dr. Schlesinger decides to leave New York and go to San
that's
Francisco.
a longer story. The chair of medicine at Cornell retired, and the powers that be at Cornell decided, well, they had to find a new chair of medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And while they were waiting, they put together a plan that Marvin Schlesinger, the chief of renal disease, and Ed Hook,
Oh, yeah?
who was chief of infectious disease, would share the chair for a year while they were seeking. All three were interested in becoming the chair,
Yeah.
but they had a few other candidates. And finally the decision was made to, that didn't work very well, having three people. Decision was made to appoint Alec Byrne from Rockefeller, a non-clinical, a research person,
Yeah.
chair of medicine. Well, that disturbed the situation a little bit.
Yeah.
All right. Ed Hook left and went to Virginia as chair.
I know that, yes.
Marvin Schlesinger
Left.
and went to join Holly Smith, who was chief of medicine out at University of California, San Francisco.
Right.
And Marvin was vice chair running the VA, but with a close association with his good old friend, Holly Smith.
Yeah.
And the renal chair became hospital chief of medicine at the hospital, hospital director.
Okay.
And Alec Barron came in, so he became chairman. And they had to then appoint a new chief of GI.
And who was that?
That was me.
Yes. Okay.
So that was in '67.
Right.
And was I ready for that? Well, I was beginning to think that I was running out of ideas for research.
Mm-hmm.
But what was happening was that I was doing too much clinical.
Yes.
I was also in charge of the house staff program. I was in charge of, they gave me some administrative responsibilities in charge of teaching for all of medicine and so on. Then I got I didn't particularly enjoy being chief of GI there.
Okay.
Because I had to almost give up research.
Right.
But I was still doing a lot of teaching.
And then you met a fair number of the Cornell, New York house staff and.
Oh, well, I knew the house staff because I was running the house staff program.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was recruiting all the.
And that would come in handy when you got a phone call about Penn State Hershey.
I got a phone call from George Harrell. He sent me a lot of information.
Tell who is George Harrell at this time?
Yes.
Who is he?
Well, he was chair of. He was the first founding dean here.
Okay.
And he had been trying. He was running a little behind with the recruitment of the chair of medicine. Because he had he'd been doing that. Well, we had in '69 we had 2 classes of medical students, and the medical students here were about to start clinical.
Yeah.
There was no hospital. They were getting a little nervous, and there was no chair of medicine. It turned out that George had already gone through many interviews, and he had divided his people into the potential applicants. Yes, I thought I was interested, but he said the information he sent me was all about this being a school to train family medicine. And that was here. And that was written up in the papers as here's medical school's going to train family physicians. And I thought, I don't think that's my bag. I'm interested in training doctors, all sorts, with research as well as clinical.
So you came for a visit?
So I thought, well, I should probably go and see. And so I wrote back and said, yes, I'd like to come and look at the program. I'd already, prior to that time, looked at a couple of other programs, Rochester and UCLA, for their associated hospitals as chief.
Yeah.
But those I turned down. So I was already on some kind of list, I must.
And you're 40 years old at this time.
Well, George had 3 lists. He had those who were over the age of 40, who were well established. And he was really not interested in somebody who was 50, who was well established, who had a reputation, because he thought that they might not have the energy, or they may just rest on their laurels. He was interested in somebody who was young. This was even reflected back when the president of the university tried to bring George here as dean. George said then, "I'm too old. You need to get somebody young and energetic." Okay?
Yeah.
And the president's comment to that was, well, when you were at Florida as dean, did you make any mistakes? Or was there anything there that you were supposed to do, that you wanted to do, that you weren't allowed to do? And so George said, well, yes, there were some things. And so the president said to George, well, why don't you come here and do it? And that's why George came, but he felt he was too old. He was looking for people who were under the age of 40, and I just made it.
So then you obviously had an ambition then to be a chairman of medicine.
I had thought of being a chairman when I was in medical school. See, back then I was doing research, and it was very clear in physiology, and it was very clear to me that I wanted to be an academic. When I was in physiology, I was doing some teaching. Then when I went to Oxford, I was doing a lot of teaching, because we had in the Dunn School of Pathology all of the pre-med students, all of the students who were in their first 2 years, and they had general pathology. And I had to teach that in the lab with the other researchers. And I didn't give any lectures, but I was a preceptor in the path lab, in the lab. So yes, I was interested in academic medicine. At that time, of course, GI, my becoming a gastroenterologist was really serendipitous, because it was what was offered.
Right.
And yes, I became a gastroenterologist, and that worked well. And of course, I didn't have any boards in gastroenterology. I was just a member of the Royal College of Physicians in internal medicine.
Right.
And I couldn't take boards in gastroenterology, even if my training had been approved, because I didn't have an internship here.
Right.
But I did sit I had to sit the examinations for my registration in medicine, for my MD registration for New York, and I had to sit the foreign doctor's exam, the ECFMG,
Right.
to come here.
So did it take one trip to Hershey to say, this is for me?
I took one trip, and I went home, and Elizabeth saw me. When Elizabeth greeted me, she said, "Oh dear," because she was a New York City girl.
Right, and by this time you have a family.
If we go to Hershey, everybody, a small town.
Right.
See, I didn't know that Hershey even existed before I came here.
Yeah.
Because Hershey chocolate? No, I didn't. It was Cadbury's chocolate, and I'd always used. I didn't know anything about Hershey. And
Now, by this time, you have how many children? You have 4 children.
oh, we had 4 children.
All 4 were born in New
Yeah,
York.
so next time we came, we all came. And it was a big disappointment to me, because all the kids wanted to do was stay at the pool and swim over at the...
At the hotel.
Yeah, well, we weren't at the hotel. We were across the street.
At the lodge.
Yeah, the lodge. But anyway, yes, we looked around, and of course, we were taken to dinner, and I was interviewed the second time by a group of medical students, and I saw 1 or 2 faculty members. Of course, the medical students would have taken anybody's chair who had a white coat on. They were pretty anxious.
Yeah. So now we sit in the library of the medical center. This was a hole in the ground when you took the job.
Oh, this was no, it wasn't a hole in the ground. It was a hole in the ground when George interviewed the first applicants for medical school. But as the hospital was being built, as the medical center, the Crescent, was being built, there was a fire on the basic science end, and that got the middle behind.
Okay.
Because that all burnt, they had to redo that, so when I came to interview, this would be in February of '69.
Okay.
The hospital was in scaffolding. it wasn't, well, maybe it wasn't quite as far along as the Children's Hospital, new Children's Hospital.
So then you officially came when in 1969?
69. I arrived in
July?
69. So he took me around. He took me, the crescent was done halfway along. The rest was still being done. The first thing that Dr. Harrell built was the animal facility. And we were down in the basement, and he showed me all of the patient labs and the whole big room of student carrels, where the students could study and so on. And then we went down to the base. He said, "Oh, do you want to go and see the animal resort facility?" And I think that was a key question. If I said, "Well, no," it would have been out.
Yeah.
Oh yes, I was very interested. But actually, it was it was fabulous.
Yeah. So when you came here, did you have an office? And where was your office?
Oh, when I finally accepted and came, my office was halfway along in the Crescent.
So you did have an office?
I had an office.
Okay.
And of course I had many medical students, but we didn't have a hospital. So, we were still recruiting other clinical chairs. But by the time the students were in the third year, we had recruited John Waldhausen in surgery, and he was part-time.
Oh.
He would come and go.
From Hopkins?
No, he was at Children's Hospital in Penn.
Oh, okay.
We had Nick Nelson, I think, was here. Well, was coming.
Pediatrics.
But initially, I had medical students for the first year when we didn't have a hospital. I had a class of medical students, and we had to put them in Harrisburg Hospital. And so the Harrisburg Hospital physicians did a very fine job of looking after them. But of course there was a problem. I had to recruit. And what problem frequently happened was that I would do a conference with the students and do rounds with the students at Harrisburg, then go to the airport and pick up a candidate and come home. But I was going back and forth all the time.
So you're a new young chair of medicine. You have to build the hospital. You have to teach medical students who are already here, and then recruiting was huge.
And it's not easy to recruit clinicians when you don't have a hospital. Yeah. But I initially focused on young faculty, residents, that I'd known as residents at Cornell.
So name some of those people that came your first recruiting.
Elaine Eister. And Bob Dye.
They were related?
Well, yes.
Husband and wife.
Bob Dye was in practice in gastroenterology, and the first person that I did recruit was
David Jenkins.
David Jenkins.
Yeah.
He had already moved from Cornell, and he was down in down south. But he had been. I had known him quite well, so he was the first faculty member that came in medicine.
So David Jenkins, hematology, Elaine Eister, hematology.
So I was a little over. I had a little too much hematology for a little while.
Because Bob Hamilton was also one of the
Bob Hamilton came fairly quickly from fellowship, and I think Bob came about the time that the hospital opened. I recruited from Cornell a neurologist,
Dr. Brennan.
I recruited from UCF, California, my first cardiologist. I'm getting a little. I was never good with names, remembering names. But so I had. By the time the hospital opened, we had in medicine, cardiologist, two hematologists, Brennan.
Yeah, Brennan in neurology.
Yeah.
Dye in gastroenterology.
Yes, and that was it. Yes.
And when did oncology come? Dr. Alan Lipton was there, wasn't he?
I think Lipton came in later in 1970. Later.
Okay, so another New Yorker, though. A lot of New Yorkers came to the country.
Yes.
Okay.
So then, of course, we had a problem. The hospital was opening.
Okay.
We had a handful. Surgery had now had Waldhausen, and he had brought with him from Penn a couple of other surgeons. So we had 3 surgeons.
All right.
We had pediatrics chief. I don't think there were any other pediatricians. Oh yes, we got another pediatrician from who had come in from that Nick Nelson knew, who was a South African.
Meisel.
Yes.
And then Chet Berlin must have been early on.
Chet came later.
Okay. And then
so we didn't have anybody in the division in emergency room. So we ran the emergency room, and we took it in turns.
Yeah. So you're doing night shifts in the emergency room.
That one of us had to sleep over night call as well.
Yeah.
So we did a day at a time. So once a week I had emergency medicine. The house staff was easy because the senior students became some interns.
Right. So when did you have your first internal medicine residency?
Well, we got a couple of, when the hospital opened, I got one resident from Cornell, whose family was here.
And what year is this now? When does the hospital?
That was in 1970.
1970.
Got one, but it was not. We were not accredited for a residency. But I got one residency, and the following year, we managed to get a few residents who had not matched. So we had a nucleus of 3 or 4 residents, and then we started getting some residents from, and we got accreditation for the residency.
So talk about Dr. Harold's philosophy of what he envisioned for this place, your vision for your internal medicine department, and how that perhaps shaped the house staff and education.
Well, there was a small difference in between what one hoped for philosophically and what one could achieve quickly.
Because survival is on your mind, I suspect.
We were heavily involved in teaching and patient care. Any thought of research, there was no time for research. Well, you really can't support research unless you've got a nucleus of people around.
Right.
So anyway, yes, I had felt when Dr. Harrell sat me down on my second visit and said, well, what do you want to do in medicine? I really thought in terms of what I was doing at Cornell. I was spending half of my time in research. I was doing some administration, and I was doing a lot of teaching. And I was doing a lot of patient care. So I thought in terms of, yes, I want to develop a department of medicine that is balanced between clinical research, with some basic research as well, and included patient care and teaching.
Right.
And clearly, that balance of activity in any division, and I was interested in developing divisions in medicine. Of course, at that time, medicine included, the department included cardiology,
neurology,
it included neurology, it included dermatology, GI, oncology. And of course now several of those what had been divisions have become separate departments. But initially we were a close-knit family.
Right.
Not very many of us, and we interrelated fairly well.
My impression was in the 70s, early 70s, Hershey was looked at as a different place, a different training place for medicine, perhaps due to its small size, perhaps due to the philosophy of Dr. Harold, who founded the place.
Well, it was a different place for medicine in the sense that, all right, how did we work out the clerkship program? The clerkship was 3 months in medicine. All the clerkships were 3 months of medicine, 3 months of surgery, 3 months of pediatrics, and 3 months of the rest. Okay? Which obviously included included psychiatry and so on. But we didn't have a psychiatrist. So we had to send people out for psychiatry. So medicine was 3 months on the inpatient service. With some of that time, the inpatient service included cardiology. So students would rotate. There was no, I think one of the major issues, George thought of this place as being a referral hospital with predominantly the outpatient clinics that he developed. There was one, the outpatients were within the hospital. I don't know where they would be placed now if we were putting them back in, but there was one little corridor with 10 rooms, which was all of medicine, including all the subdivisions. And the adjacent corridor was surgery, and the next corridor was pediatrics.
So then a time of tremendous growth, because as you're building your clinical department, other clinical departments, the basic sciences are up and running, though. You have microbiology, and you had Howard Morgan in physiology, and
And the basic science departments, which were beginning to be well developed, became a major resource for medicine. Because this enabled me to recruit faculty who had an interest in basic science, and they could have a joint appointment, for example, in cardiology. Cardiology was pretty busy with their cath lab and all their patients, but one of the cardiologists had a joint appointment with Howard Morgan, and did research with Howard Morgan. So they became an enormous benefit to medicine, to faculty. For example, in neurology, one of the early neurologists was interested in microbiology.
Yeah, Rick Tenser, I think, had
Rick Tenser,
yeah.
And he had a joint appointment
Right.
in cancer therapy.
Right, in microbiology.
Yeah.
So then by the mid-'70s, late '70s, you've established a gastroenterology fellowship training program.
Right.
So the growth allowed for that to happen.
Yes. Well, initially we had a small problem. We had a fiscal problem. When I first came, George Harrell gave me my budget. He had budgeted for 2 or 3 secretaries, and I think there were 3 faculty positions.
Small.
Yes.
Tight budget.
Unfortunately, the original $50 million and the funds that George managed to get from the feds for the hospital and so on was running pretty thin. It had been said that when the whole place was established, that this was not going to cost anything to the legislation. So there was no money coming from the state. The university obviously was pretty anxious. University trustees are pretty anxious about how much money is being spent on building. And by the time we were underway, there were really difficult problems. For example, the basic scientists wanted to add another piece to the building. And they figured that this would bring in more money with grants. The university declined. Told George Harrell, no, you can't build anything else. But the basic science chairs put their heads together and went back to the university trustees themselves and said, look, we need this building. We can generate enough money to cover the cost. So we got the building. That was the difficulty we had.
Yeah.
And I felt all along that did not have enough. We weren't generating. I mean, when you have one gastroenterologist, even 2, hematology doesn't make any money.
Yeah.
2 hematologists, all right, we at that stage had 4 cardiologists, and we had a cath lab. But cardiology did generate a little bit more, but there's not enough money being generated for research. And I wasn't getting any more money. Until you get a larger group.
Critical mass.
It's difficult to, all right, by the early 80s, there was a problem finding enough money to pay for research techs and people who were just doing research. And of course there were folks here who were pretty anxious to get on with it.
Yeah.
That applied to cardiology. It applied particularly to endocrinology. Dick Santon was doing research. He had grants, but there were not enough. There was not enough income to really support it well.
So now, there was this precedent then that the clinical activities margin were what supported the research activities.
Right.
In excess of what you could get from grants. So that tension is today and it was yesterday.
Yeah.
Yeah, so then you're into the 80s you're growing, there's tension, there's continued growth, and then you step down, you're division chief of gastroenterology.
We got our third, I must say, after George Harrell retired, the next chief,
Dean.
The next dean, who had come up from, he had come up. He had originally been one of George Harrell's people down at the University of Florida, and so he came up an obstetrician. He was pretty tight in terms of money. He generated. He wasn't giving out a lot of money back to the chairs. For example, I found out that the monies coming from the NIH, from the feds, for teaching by house staff and so on, did not come to the Department of Medicine. Harry Prostowski was squirreling it away.
Yes.
Actually, it did us a big service because Harry saved enough money for the next dean to build again.
Yeah.
And that was good.
Yeah.
But I can remember many times my budget was, I was in the red. And I would go to Harry and say, look, I need more money for technicians or such and such, and he'd look at it and say, well, get rid of some of your secretaries. But I would spend an hour in Harry's office and 59 minutes would be spent with Harry sitting there telling me how great things were and how great he was.
Yeah.
And the last minute was, well, you need such and such. Go and talk to I'm trying to think of what his formal title was, but go and talk to the finance person.
Yeah, the hospital director or something.
Yeah, and that didn't work. But then, of course, we recruited the third chair, McAllister Everts, a surgeon, an orthopedic surgeon.
Yes.
And he had some ideas about education, and obviously he was interested in building. And he was able to use, in a way, the money that Harry had squirreled away.
Right.
And this, where we are, the building, the addition behind the hospital.
Basic medical research building.
Medical research building.
So then, 1982, you step down as chief of gastroenterology, but then 1988, you step away as chairman of medicine.
Right.
Difficult decision?
Well, no, it wasn't. Yes, I realized that this was an enormous opportunity because Everts had just approved. We were just adding to hospital beds. Okay, we were just adding research facility. And with the increase in the hospital and the outpatient clinic was obviously again established by.
So you thought a good window of
it was the time for opportunity for somebody else to come in as chair and develop, expand the research program. And that, of course, was where there was a dramatic increase.
So Dr. Reynolds...
And Herb Reynolds came in, and he was given the opportunity. He initially was given the green light to go ahead with recruitment for basic investigation to expand it. Well, I think that was a little difficult because shortly afterwards there was there was some kind of fiscal problem where he wasn't able to do that as much as he wanted.
Yeah. But nonetheless, you felt you left the ship in good shape and opportunity.
A faculty size now was reaching going beyond the critical mass, so that we had more people and income was increasing dramatically.
Yeah.
And by the time Herb decided to move back to the NIH, and Bob Abel was coming on. Bob, of course, came in the early 70s as chief of infectious disease. One of the last divisions that we developed, because infectious disease was being run by pediatrics for a long time. And when Bob Abel came on, that was when we dramatically increased in terms of income and total faculty.
So now, you're chairman of medicine for nearly 20 years.
Yeah.
So you're now drifting into your retirement years at the age of 60.
I realized that, I had to do something. I obviously wasn't going to go back to research, but I thought, well, I need to go back to gastroenterology. I was doing a little bit of gastroenterology before that, as chair. But when I trained in gastroenterology, we didn't have the flexible scopes were just coming in.
Right.
And I didn't want to spend I was busy doing other things. I didn't learn colonoscopy or upper endoscopy.
Yeah.
When I was first came to Cornell, yes, they were doing upper endoscopy with the old scopes that were semi-flexible. Tubes that had a little bit on the end that would just if you were lucky.
Well, I know luckily here you had a good teacher of endoscopy, so we got your endoscopy skills up. But let me just mention, so then, after you were chair, then you were a Fulbright scholar in India. You were a visiting professor at Zimbabwe.
In the early 80s.
Yeah.
In the early 80s, I decided that, I've been doing this for a while and I haven't taken a sabbatical. And I thought, well, most people who take a sabbatical, 6-month sabbatical, go and do research somewhere, but I'm not doing research. So I would do a teaching sabbatical. And I got a Fulbright for that, to go to India.
Right. But then you also went to Zimbabwe.
Well, I did
Africa.
3 months in India and 3 months in Zimbabwe.
Okay.
The 3 months in India were the hospital I went to. Now this goes back further. The obstetrician that delivered David in Oxford. Shortly afterwards, the next 6 months later, went to India and became chief of obstetrics at the Christian Medical College in Ludhiana. Beryl Howie. And I thought, well, I will go to the Christian Medical College in Ludhiana for 3 months. I wrote to them, and that was fine. And I thought, well, I will see Beryl Howie again. Well, she had just retired and got home to New Zealand. Became a very distinguished professor there. They built a new hospital for her, obstetric hospital. So I went to Ludhiana, and because I was on Fulbright, I was expected to tour around and give lectures to everywhere in India. and I probably gave 20 lectures of the length and breadth of India. That was fine, but most of the time, and I took some medical students with me to Ludhiana. 6 medical students came with me.
And then on to Zimbabwe for 3 months in
Africa. Then after that, the following year, and of course it was our winter time and their summer that I went. I had 3 months in Zimbabwe at the University of Zimbabwe in Harare. That was before Mugabe had run the place into the ground. And the Zimbabwe, the medical school, was remarkably, it was very British. I was given I became an attending at the old Harare Hospital, which was an 1,000-bed hospital in the black section of town, of the city. There were 6 of us on the faculty in medicine. I had 1 clinic a week where I would see, I would admit 30 patients from the clinic and spend the rest of the week in the hospital trying to get them well and out of the hospital before the next clinic. And this was all general medicine, no GI. And I saw a lot of tropical medicine. I saw a lot of general medicine, third world medicine.
And you were also seeing HIV infection. Were you also seeing HIV infections?
Yeah.
So this was...
and I had house staff and students. So it, again, was a very teaching. And we did do a couple of trips out. We did a trip out with a pediatrician, and I went out to a lot of the mission hospitals around where we also taught, did some teaching and actually sent some patients back to the hospital. So I got my first great experience of tropical medicine, a little bit from Ludhiana in the Punjab, but much more from, that was mostly third world medicine, much more from Zimbabwe, from Harare. Their idea was that if you, the priority in terms of health care there was pediatrics, immunization, and child and maternal health. If somebody, for example, went into renal failure, they didn't have a chronic dialysis program, but we would do acute dialysis, peritoneal dialysis. And if the patient didn't get better, we sent him home.
So then between 1989 and 1998, you went 2 months a year to Tenwick Hospital in Kenya.
Well, partly to Tenwick, but we also went down to down through South Africa to one of the African countries adjacent.
Swaziland, I believe.
Swaziland. Which, that was an experience in itself. In Swaziland, we were at at a hospital run by, well, it was one of the major hospitals, one of the 2 big hospitals, but it was a Christian-related hospital. But it also had a school attached to it and a lot of land, and the local town wanted the land. And I think, I'm not sure even the hospital is still there, but that was that was a fascinating experience because it was third world medicine, but again it was total medicine.
Mm-hmm.
Some GI. I did some GI at Tenwick because I took a scope with me,
Mm-hmm.
and they had a lot of ulcer disease. All H. pylori positive, and I was doing flow tests on
Right.
them all.
Uh-huh.
The only ones that were negative, and I hadn't heard anything about this because we don't have that possibility. Obviously, all of the ulcer patients that were H. pylori positive, but some of the patients were coming from the TB unit,
Oh.
and they were on full antituberculous therapy. They were negative. Antituberculous therapy probably takes care of H. pylori,
Oh, interesting.
but I don't know of any data on that.
So in your retirement years, you're going to India, going to Zimbabwe, Swaziland,
Yes.
Kenya, and you're bringing Hershey medical students with you. And
Yes.
Why do you do that? Why the need?
Well,
what's the purpose?
The students who were with me
Uh-huh.
when I was on sabbatical had a fabulous time.
Mm-hmm.
It was very clear from what they saw that this was a great experience, something that they would never get here.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, well, global health is something that these people, hopefully, it would be helpful if students who had that experience would continue to do some overseas work when they were physicians. My mentor, that was very important at that time, was Jim Teeter. Jim had set up his practice in general surgery down in Waynesboro.
Waynesboro, Pennsylvania.
There were three of them down there. Jim was the chief of surgery at Waynesboro Hospital. But the three of them, they had set up the practice in such a way that each of the three members would every year spend some time away, 2 to 3 months every year, in a mission hospital somewhere in the world. Jim did that, and Jim always took students with him. Jim was a graduate from University of Maryland, but he was getting students from the University of Maryland. But then when we got established, a lot of the students who went with Jim, that was before, were from here. And it was clear that these students were coming back very different. Jim was only going to mission hospitals, and Tenwick was one of the important hospitals that he would go to. He was invited by the students in I think it was in 1988, just before I retired from the chair, to be the AOA lecturer. And he lectured about his experience. And afterwards, I knew Jim because he'd come here or at least once a month to shadow in surgery. He might want to go to dermatology or to plastic surgery or whatever to keep up with techniques. And he would go to surgical grand rounds often. So I knew him. We taught him also endoscopy.
We did.
Yeah, and I said after that lecture, I said to Jim, Jim, I'm going to be retiring from the chair soon. I would be interested in coming with you. And he was a very polite fellow. He didn't even raise his eyebrows about what a chair of medicine would do in the third world.
No.
He had no idea, I think, that I would be competent even in a situation where there were no facilities.
Right.
But I was fairly confident at that stage, having had the 6 months away, that I could probably manage.
But you say this global health experience changes the medical student, not only that they could offer that services, or hopefully would in
Well,
their
they
career,
see-
but they come back different people.
It puts them in a situation where culturally the idea was that it needed to be a long enough period that they had to stay in one place. You know, this had been a vision, one of George Harrell's visions as well, early on. He had set up in the student curriculum a 2-month elective in the senior year. And he wrote it up in such a way that this would be 2 months. You had to stay at 2 months. You could only go to a third world country. The elective did not include time in Europe or England or Australia or New Zealand. And you had, preferably you would go to a mission hospital because they have resources. And probably faculty from here, physicians from here or from England. And so occasional students all the time, ever since the beginning, have gone off for this elective. And they would always come back very excited about having, been in a situation where they were out of their comfort zone, where they had an experience of another culture and were seeing things that they'd never see here. So it was partly cultural, it was partly, obviously it was very clinical, and they were doing things that they never dreamed they could do.
Right.
Okay, and those Jim Teeter would have them working with him as his first assistant.
Right.
And so I figured when I got back that I would continue with Jim to take students, and that expanded what was into the global health as another experience.
So there's a philosophical basis for what you've done since retirement.
Well, I was giving back. You see, remember, way back, the resources I got to go to Oxford all came from the Rhodes Scholarship, the Rhodes Trust. That was all generated from the minds of Zimbabwe. Okay? So in a way, I was also giving back. But I found it was exciting to be involved in something new. Okay?
Where does religion play a role in what you've done?
A little bit, because we were at mission hospitals. But you know, that became, all right, one had to adjust. Most mission hospitals are very evangelical. Unfortunately, they're back when they first developed. They were to let's save these poor people out there who aren't Christian. Let's save souls, you know?
Yeah.
And let's save souls. That they were very all right. The missions were competing between the various religious orders. For example, at Tenwick,
This is Kenya.
the Tenwick physicians and the people that they trained had no time for the local Catholic mission that was not far away. They wouldn't take Catholic students. Okay? That was a problem. So you had to adjust to a new language, but that was easy because at least the high school was high schools were teaching English. That had I only went to what had been former English colonies. Okay.
Yeah.
So there was enough English, and we always had a translator on the wards. You would make rounds with a translator, so you could communicate, and that was fine. So you had the cultural, you had the medical difference, and you had the religious difference.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I observed, there were in the hospital. This became a big hospital. It was a 300-bed hospital, and they had
two to a bed, right? Two to
what?
a bed in this 300-bed house. 2 patients to a bed.
Oh, often, yes, and relatives sleeping under the bed.
Yes.
And you would top and tail the patients.
Yeah.
They always had room for more patients. And the hospital, normally the hospital did not have, all right, when Jim and I were there, frequently there was no pediatrician, there was no obstetrician, there was no radiologist. Jim was the only surgeon. I had medicine and peds, and you did everything. And the students became house officers in a way. But you were doing things that were perhaps, well, you would not be doing them here, let's put it that way.
Yeah. But you're Presbyterian by faith.
Yes, I'm
You're an elder in the Derry Presbyterian Church. Where
they
does
decided that the hospital chaplains, they trained hospital chaplains in their what had been originally Methodist mission. And I was making rounds, and I found that there were, the chaplains should write notes. And I found on rounds that there were notes written by the chaplain. Oh, the note would go like this. I visited with this patient today. She is a Catholic believer. She is not saved. So seeing this, I approached where the chaplains, there were 3, when they were having chai in the morning. And I sat down with them, I said, I have a problem. I've just been rounding, and I see notes that you have written. This patient is not saved. Who decides when somebody's saved?
Did he get an answer?
No. Oh, but they're Catholic. Oh, they believe in the Pope. Oh, it was a crazy answer.
Yeah.
And where did this come from? It came from the missionaries.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was. So that was something else you had to live with.
Yeah.
So you managed. Okay.
So now your role back at the Hershey Medical Center,
Yeah.
the Global Health Initiative, you're involved with PBL, problem-based learning, teaching of the students. You come back to being the teacher.
I came back, and when I got, I was enjoying straightforward endoscopy, colonoscopy, upper GI, and I had on a regular rotation through this time when I was here, and Priscilla taught me quite a lot, but the fellows taught me a lot.
Priscilla being the head nurse of the endoscopy
the nurse
unit.
in charge of endoscopy, who had been here forever when we only had one room for scoping.
Right.
You remember those days.
I do remember those days,
You
yes.
prepped the patient out in the corridor.
Yes.
One patient at a time. We weren't doing it, it was always inpatient. You admitted your colonoscopies.
True.
Well, I learned a little bit about that. I don't think I was ever very good.
You were good enough.
But I managed, and from then on, the fellows taught me a lot.
True.
But when I got to be 80, my chief thought that I shouldn't be doing it anymore.
Who was the chief?
So then I said, oh, all right. And probably it was sometime around then, or a little before then, when I stopped doing, of course I was running a general medicine clinic, in a general medicine clinic as well. And 3 years ago I gave up my general medicine clinic. Of course, many of my patients either retired and moved somewhere or died. And so I didn't have very many patients. I was doing some. I was doing some exact physicals,
Right.
which kept me fairly busy for a while. But that faded down, and so I gave up my internal medicine clinic 2 years ago, and I just had the fellows clinic. And of course, the fellows clinic. I don't know. I gained more from the fellows clinic than the fellows did from me. You know.
So let's. You're now a teacher yet again. You've always been a teacher, but teaching medical students. Let's talk about the core mission of medicine and the core mission of someone in academic medicine to be a teacher, the patient-doctor relationship. What in the last few minutes, give us your philosophy of medicine.
Yeah.
For students who are now and students to come.
Yeah. For students, even in this situation, one of the most important things for a student is to have a mentor. And I can think back, and I kind of appreciate this more now as I think back. I had some superb mentors that played an enormous role in my education and development. Mm-hmm. From high school, the person in the high school, his name was McCarthy. We always called him Mac. He'd been a rugby player earlier on, but he was very good in the sciences. Mm-hmm. And he mentored me in science and math. When I went to medical school, the chair of physiology, Jack Eccles, one of the early neurophysiologists who had a Nobel Prize. He was the one that encouraged me to consider, it was then that I decided that I was doing academic medicine. Mm-hmm. The other faculty didn't play much role. All right, one or two colleagues who were a few years ahead. I remember when I was a senior student at Auckland at the hospital, Jack Sinclair, who I'd known athletically, was a senior registrar. Jack did a lot for me. He would, I could go, Jack might be on pediatrics, I could go onto pediatrics and he would give me a case. Go and see this patient. Mm-hmm. And go over it with me. Actually, I wasn't allowed to look at the records or anything like that. He would quiz me on it. Uh-huh. Yeah, that was very good. When I was at Oxford, Howard Florey was a little different. Yes, he was my official mentor, but he had no. I would pass him occasionally on the stairway. I was coming back from my time at the track in the early afternoon. I had already done my workout, and I would meet him on the stairway. And his first comment would be, "And what have you discovered today, Jeffries?" Well, you never have an answer to anything that he asks you.
Yeah.
So I always felt a little bit uncertain in his presence.
Yeah.
But he did meet with us about once a week when he was around to go through where we were.
Yeah.
That was important, research-wise. When I became clinical at Oxford, the pediatrician that I spent 6 months on pediatrics as my medicine internship bit was Victoria Smallpiece. She was fabulous in terms of patient care and relating to patients and relating to people. That was very important. And then, of course, Sheila Sherlock. Sheila was a fabulous teacher. She loved her. Oh, she always had a gathering every week, a gathering of foreigner people who were there to have a seminar with her on hepatology. And this was a patient discussion usually on the ward. And you would have 20, well, maybe 10 American, Indian, whatever, students around who were sitting there, membership. That was fabulous. She interrelated well. And of course, Tom Almy, who had originally suggested that who was now chief of GI at the Cornell division at Bellevue. Tom was terrific. Marvin, George Harrell.
George Harrell was a big figure in your life.
Yeah. That's important. And I think that now, I think one has to appreciate that you are gaining tremendous support from your mentors. I think that the focus on caring for people is so important.
And giving back seems to be a big thing
yes,
of your life.
Yes, you're right. And whether it's education, giving back, or, education is always a two-way street. And I think that I'm really serious when I say that, I learn more from you guys probably at this stage than you learn from me.
We learn a lot from you every day.
That's important. And
so what are the attributes that make a good physician, that make a good doctor?
I think the first one has to be caring for people. When I spend a lot of time right now reviewing student applicants for medical school. I put a bigger focus on the students' activities that relate to outreach. If I see somebody, if I review a dossier that somebody has gotten a 4.0 grade point average and have done nothing else, they're not going to be invited. So we probably put, I think this is general now, that put a higher priority on what else have you done. Of course, that would mean that if I were applying to medical school, as I did, is it 60 or 70 years ago? 60 years ago, I wouldn't be in medicine, because I didn't have any of this. Because I was very young then, and yes, I had worked at home, but and outreach, concern for others, past medical experience, no.
Okay.
Even when I was at Cornell, of course I wasn't interviewing medical students, but back in those days in the 60s, if your father was a doctor and you were male and you had or you'd gone to, in America, you had gone to an Ivy League school and you had a strong GPA, you automatically could get into medical school. Not so now.
Yeah.
No.
And
I
that's
think,
good.
I think that is a great, you don't go into medicine anymore to make money. If that's the reason, you're going to burn out very quickly. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I remember when you stepped down as being chairman of medicine.
Yeah.
And we had a Jeffries day at the medical center, and
Yeah.
we brought back former students and early staff members, and we had a nice day of
Yeah.
lectures. And then that evening, we had a dinner in your honor, and you got some praise, and you got some joking, and then you were asked to address the group,
Yeah.
and
What did I say?
you said, "I love you."
Oh, yes.
So implying love is what generates
Yeah.
motivation
Yeah.
and giving back
Yeah.
and a long, distinguished career.
Yeah.
Well, this has been an honor for me to do this, and I think we've covered the past 89 years pretty well, and I thank you for doing this.
Yeah. And I will hang it. I am just at the stage now. I've decided that I will reapply for my license. Another 2 years. Because who knows, I may need it. You may need it.
We may need you, yes.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so I am struggling with the computer.
There we go. Graham, wonderful.
Tom, thank you. Yes.